Hey guys, Rob here. Before we get started, I want to let you guys know that this podcast is brought to you by the great guys over at Anchor.fm. Anchor is the easiest way to make a podcast. They're the only guys that I've ever used, and I've never had a problem. Always a great source for your podcasting needs. They have everything in one place. You can do it right from your computer, or if you wanted to, you could even do it straight from your phone. They have creation tools. You can edit, you can record. It sounds great. But the biggest key that I found with Anchor.fm is that they will do all the distribution themselves. You just record, post, and they will be able to put it out there on all of the major platforms: Spotify, Apple, Google, Stitcher, all the major podcatching apps. These guys do it all for you with one click of the button. If you wanted to try your hand at sponsorships, these guys are a great gateway to trying that avenue if you wanted to try to make some revenue. I can't recommend these guys enough. Download the Anchor app or go to Anchor.fm to get started.
Welcome one and welcome all to the JRPG Century Club. Follow along with Rob in his quest to beat 100 JRPGs. Each week we delve into a new Japanese role-playing game, complete with the game's history, story, and other mechanics. Rob will also add his thoughts on each game, including what info made it up onto the big board. So grab your axe and shield, or staff and wizard hat if you're too squishy, and share this odyssey with me as I make it all the way to 100.
Hello, welcome everyone to Game 1 of the JRPG Century Club. My name is Rob, and I'm glad to have you aboard for this maiden voyage as I make my way through 100 Japanese role-playing games. This week we'll be going over Final Fantasy II. As far as my previous week in gaming, I just hit the 75-hour mark in Xenoblade Chronicles 1, the definitive edition on Switch. Maybe hitting 100 hours on this one. I'm projecting it to be around there as far as where I am in the story versus how much I have left to do. As part of my play style, every 25 hours I try to switch out a game on the Switch. That way I'm keeping things fresh and not burning out on certain games, and I'm always cycling through these games. I also started Fell Seal Arbiter's Mark on the Switch. I'm about 6 to 7 hours in on that game. For those that don't know, Fell Seal Arbiter's Mark is a complete homage to the Final Fantasy Tactics game that was back on the PlayStation 1 in the late 90s. It's a very good homage to that game, very dedicated to reliving the glory from that game. I'm enjoying it so far, taking my time with it, learning how it works, how it is a little different from Tactics while trying to be in the same vein as Tactics. So far so good. More to come on that as the weeks go by. And also Trails in the Sky's second chapter on Steam. I'm about halfway through chapter 3, about at the 35-36 hour mark. And for those that know these Trails Kiseki games, they also can be long, which is fine. Those games are considered more of a slow burn with as far as story building and character development. That one may also hit 100 hours. We'll just have to see as the weeks go along with my progress. And now for some RPG news. Capcom's latest entry in the Monster Hunter series is now out worldwide. Monster Hunter Rise is available physically and digitally on Nintendo Switch. The company released a new launch trailer. The game features 2 new major gameplay features, Wyvern Riding and the vertical movement assisting Wirebug. While Palamutes join Phalines as support-based companions, it also adds the Rampage, a gameplay mode where players are tasked with defending the village from numerous monsters attacking at once with assistance from defensive replacements. I know that Monster Hunter has a huge following. I know one of my sons has Monster Hunter World on the PS4, and he enjoys that. I know that Switch players are now very happy to get their own dedicated game. And I think the Monster Hunter series has nowhere to go but up from here. Chris Tales gets a new trailer, and a voice cast is revealed. Modus Games released a new trailer for the upcoming Chris Tales. The new 2-minute video introduces the game's main characters and comes alongside the announcement of the game's voice cast. Chris Tales is billed as a love letter to the classic JRPG. The game features a strategic turn-based combat system and aims to let players look into the past, act in the present, and watch as those actions change the future using protagonist Chris Bell's time-affecting abilities. Chris Tales is set to launch on Nintendo Switch, PlayStation 4, PlayStation 5, Xbox One, Xbox Series X, Google Stadia, and PC in July 2021. Now, this may be a game that I may look at once it comes out. It seems pretty interesting. If they're saying it's a love letter to the classic JRPGs, then that may fall well into the wheelhouse of what I'm trying to do here. Graphic style looks kind of Persona-esque, so this may be something that you'll be hearing about on this podcast down the line. And finally, Cyberpunk 2077 receives a new patch. Cyberpunk 2077 receives a new patch. CD Projekt Red released a new patch for Cyberpunk 2077. The version 1.2 patch is available for PC, PlayStation 4 and 5, Xbox One and Series XS, and Google Stadia. It includes a large number of bug fixes. The full list of changes is available on CD Projekt Red's website. Cyberpunk 2077, as everyone knows, was released on December 10th, 2020, following major disparities between the console and PC versions, along with a number of technical issues. The game was delisted from the digital PlayStation Store and has not been yet reinstated. As we all know, the game was delayed 6-7 months from its original release window of March, April, I believe. Those playing on the PlayStation 4 and that generation of consoles were experiencing some, from what I've heard, horrendous game-breaking bugs. I never purchased it for PS4. I'm looking to buy a PS5. I'm one of the many, many millions of people with money in hand saying, I want to buy, here's money, I'm throwing money at you. But the PS5s just aren't there. This may be a purchase for PS5, one of my PS5 purchases, but haven't had a chance to experience anything firsthand with Cyberpunk. So hopefully this patch can at least help out those bugs that are on some of the higher end systems, the PS5s. And now a word from our sponsors.
Are you a fan of high fantasy epic book series that are converted into television series? No, not that one. I mean an epic book series that is actually complete. I'm referring to The Wheel of Time, Robert Jordan's fantasy masterpiece that was completed posthumously by Brandon Sanderson. Well, I have the perfect podcast for you. The Taverin is a Wheel of Time podcast where three gentlemen go through the series one chapter at a time, in their own special way. Follow along as Bill, Rob, and Rich re-experience this great epic. Experience for yourself a world full of vibrant locations, colorful characters, and storylines that will never fail to surprise. Visit a world that Game of Thrones can only wish was as fleshed out and complete. The Taverin, a Wheel of Time podcast, is part of the We Can Make This Work Probably network of podcasts. Find our podcast wherever you get your podcast feed, or visit probablywork.com for episodes of this podcast and other great shows. We will see you at the Wine Spring Inn.
Hey everyone, Scott here with my good pal Rich. Say hi, Rich.
Hi.
And we're here today to tell you about a podcast we host together with our buddies Jay and Bill, the RPG After Years.
The after what?
The RPG After Years. Our show has entered into a new era of covering everything RPGs, both old and new. Thus it is after its first era. It's the After Years.
I thought RPG was rocket-propelled grenade.
No, RPG stands for role-playing game. It's a genre of video game. Every week we go through the latest news and discuss other relevant RPG-related topics. We also review RPGs as we complete them.
So an RPG is not a rabid Portuguese goose?
No, thank God. From Dragon Quest and Final Fantasy to The Witcher and Cyberpunk, we've got RPGs covered from the dawn of time to the far-flung future.
Oh, I've heard of Final Fantasy.
I'd hope so. So check us out on iTunes or whatever your preferred podcast listening platform happens to be. You can also find us at probablywork.com. Level up your podcast feed with the RPG After Years.
Enjoy the show.
All right, today, so we will be going over game number 1, Final Fantasy II. Developed by Square Company Limited and published by Square Company Limited. Directed by Hironobu Sakaguchi, the Gooch Man himself. Produced by Masafumi Miyamoto. And music composed by Nobuo Uematsu, who I have a note here is A Man Out of Time. For those that don't know, Nobuo Uematsu was the composer for a majority of the Final Fantasy games in its early run, of its first few generations of games. In my opinion, hands down, is one of the greatest musical composers of video game history. I say he's a man at a time because I'd like to say if he was born maybe 300 or 400 years ago, he would be considered one of the classic composers. That's how strongly I believe in his ability to just create mood and emotion and feel and impact from music alone. He was a pioneer. The music in almost everything he touches is just outright brilliant. The North American release date for Final Fantasy II was April 8th, 2003. 15 years after its original Japan release. Final Fantasy I was released in Japan in 1987. Final Fantasy II was released 1 year later in Japan. From what I was able to find, the North American release was delayed such because Final Fantasy I was released in North America at the end of the NES cycle. And the thought was we have two other Final Fantasy games on that generation in Japan, but everything is going to move toward, everything in North America has now kind of shifted to this new software, the Super NES. The thought in Japan was, well, let's take our next release, Final Fantasy IV, and repackage and repurpose that to the North American crowd as Final Fantasy II, so that they can play it on their new systems. More on that later as we get to those games. Back then, Japan had their games, North America had their games, and the two didn't much commingle in the 80s and early 90s. Since then, in today's day, it's a worldwide market, but back then it was very much segregated to its individual countries and localizations. So because of that, it was 15 years before America got an official release. First system in North America to have it was the PlayStation 1 as part of the Final Fantasy Origins bundle. That game included, I believe, 1 and 2. Since then, this game has been released in North America on Game Boy Advanced, PlayStation Portable, Apple iOS, and Android. My experience with the game, I didn't really know of its existence until the mid-90s. ROMs, being able to play overseas games through an emulator was a thing. I remember playing Final Fantasy II on an emulator in the mid-late 90s, and I played all of about 20 minutes of it, and I was like, nope, not for me. Fast forward a few more years, I did pick up Final Fantasy II for the PSP. Same thing, play for about an hour and a half. Oh my god, this gameplay. I can't get into it. It's so off of what I'm used to with Final Fantasy. It was just too much. Fast forward again to 2017, my determination to try and say that I've beaten more than one Final Fantasy and try to claim being a Final Fantasy fan. I persevered. I made it through. I slayed Emperor Mateus, suck on my blood sword, and I was able to now say, I've beaten 2 Final Fantasy games. Yay me. And now let's delve into the story of Final Fantasy II. Everyone, gather around the fire, and let me spin you a tale. Listen closely, as I impart unto you the story of Final Fantasy II. Final Fantasy II begins as Firion, Maria, Guy, and Leon are attacked by Palamecian Black Knight soldiers and left for dead. Firion, Maria, and Guy are rescued by Princess Hilda, who has established a rebel base in the town of Altair after her kingdom of Fynn was invaded by the Emperor. Hilda denies their request to join the rebel army because they are far too young and inexperienced. The three set off for Fynn in search of Leon. There they find a dying Prince Scott of Cassian, Hilda's fiancé, who informs them that the former nobleman of Cassian, Borgin, betrayed the rebellion and became a general in the Imperial Army. The party returns to Altair to inform Hilda. She allows the group to join the rebellion and asks them to journey north to find Mithril, a metal which could be used to create powerful weapons. The party makes its way north to the occupied village of Salamand, saves the villagers forced to work in the nearby mines, kills Borgin, and retrieves the Mithril. For their next mission, the party is sent to the city of Bafsk to prevent the construction of a large airship known as the Dreadnought. However, it takes off just as they arrive. After retrieving the Sunfire, a weapon which can blow up the Dreadnought, they watch helplessly as an airship with Hilda on board is captured by the Dreadnought. When the Dreadnought lands to stock up on supplies, the party rescues Hilda and throws the Sunfire into the airship's engine. Before escaping from the explosion, the party encounters a Dark Knight, whom Maria thinks she recognizes as Leon. On his deathbed, the King of Fynn tasks the party to seek the help of the seemingly extinct dragoons of Deist. In Deist, the party finds only a mother with her son, learning that all but one of the dragoons are dead, partly as a result of the Imperial poison. After placing an egg of the last wyvern in the cavern, the party returns to Altair and rescues Hilda from the Empire a second time, before successfully reclaiming Fynn from the Imperial forces. They then travel west in search of a powerful magic item, joining forces with the last surviving dragoon on the way. The party returns to Fynn and sees that many towns have been destroyed by a cyclone summoned by the Emperor. The party calls upon the newly born last wyvern to take them to a castle inside the cyclone, where they confront and kill the Emperor. Back at Fynn, everyone celebrates the Emperor's defeat, but a mortally wounded Fynn soldier arrives and reveals that Leon has taken over the throne and plans to destroy the rebels with the Imperial army. The party enters the castle of Palamisia and confronts Leon. However, the Emperor reappears in the throne room in a new demonic form, revealing he has returned from hell with the intention of destroying the entire world. The party and Leon escape Palmesia Castle with the Wyvern, as the castle is replaced with the Palace of Hell, Pandemonium. Leon agrees to help the group seal the Emperor away. The party travels to the Jade Passage, an underground passage to the underworld, and finds the portal to Pandemonium, where they finally defeat the Emperor. Afterwards, Leon chooses to leave in response to the trouble he has caused, though Firion assures him that he'll be welcomed back if and when he returns. So all in all, keeping in mind that this story and this game is originally from the late 80s, this story is pretty solid. It's definitely much more involved than Final Fantasy I. For those who have played and experienced Final Fantasy I, there's a very light, not lighthearted, but light story where it's basically go from A to B to B to C to C to D, and then time loop, kill the final boss. Very high level, but back when the first one was being made, it was all about the game and getting it out there and seeing if there's a public demand for that type of game, which obviously we know that there is, that there was a sequel born. So they decided to flesh out more of a story. They succeeded. There is a full-on story with ups and downs and good guys and bad guys becoming good guys and all the kind of story beats that you would see. There is a strong comparison that has been made to Star Wars Episode 4, The New Hope, complete with Death Star / Dreadnought / Emperor Palpatine versus Emperor Mateus / Hero's Journey type thing. I do get that. I do see that. There was a lot of sacrifice in this game. You started as a team of 4, but after 5 minutes you become a party of 3 with that 4th spot revolving with playable NPCs. All in all, the story was, for its time, pretty good. My thoughts on gameplay. Yes, and to quote a YouTuber, yes, it's that Final Fantasy game. The things that made Final Fantasy brilliant in the first couple generations is the gameplay, progression system, the leveling system, the need to always progress farther to get to the next level, to get more powerful, to beat the next thing, and that's done by defeating your enemies and gaining experience and progressing levels that way. Final Fantasy II said, let's be a little bit experimental. Instead of having levels, we'll have each ability increased as it's used. You want to be stronger with the sword, swing the sword more. You want to be more powerful with your fire spell, you got to cast it more. They took this to extremes. You want to be able to evade attacks more, you need to run away. If you want your hit points to go up, you need to lose hit points in order to gain more max hit points. It was a system that took getting used to. It's not my favorite system. YouTubers and other experts of this game have said before, it is a very exploitable system, but that balances out with the difficulty curve stems from a lot of the enemies using status effects that you may not be prepared for. Your whole team could be stoned, your whole team could be put to sleep, your whole team could be instant death. There's all kinds of things that could happen. You could have one encounter that's your team before versus 9 enemies on the screen. You have to whittle your way through the 9 enemies just to make it through the battle, and this is just random battles. The gameplay took getting used to. Once you get used to it, you can, by maybe the half point, you can get into a good rhythm of what you need to do to progress through the game so you're not stuck. Or just find the blood sword and just own the final boss with the blood sword. That's another option too. Once again, this game was exploitable if you knew what to do. Graphically, this game was on par with its original game of Final Fantasy I. Held back by the limitations of the NES, they did the best they could with what they had. One thing that this game did have was on-screen kind of events, cutscenes I would say, especially the scene where Hilda in her airship is being chased by the Dreadnought. And in future versions that North America gets, obviously the graphics are updated and the music is done by Nobuo Uematsu, so you're going to get a very strong OST. And as with all games that he works on, you'll always get a strong OST, so you won't go wrong there. And now on to the big board. Let me bring up my board. Alright, so this game I played on my iPhone, Apple iOS. My completion date was January 18th, 2017. My final playtime, 26 hours, 56 minutes. My final percentage of completion, 106%. This game didn't have a lot of side quests, a lot of extra stuff to do. We're very much in the infancy of JRPGs. The thought was to have your story and progress to the end. There were a few little side things to do, but the extra 6% probably came from me maybe meandering or backtracking, or main character was Firion of Finn. My final level, as I mentioned in the pilot, I'm looking at you, Final Fantasy II. They completely disregarded traditional level building. So for my stat keeping purposes, I took Firion's last physical rating and his last magical rating and averaged that out to be his level, quote unquote. So he ended the game with a physical score of 33 and a magical score of 50. That becomes a level of 41.5 used for my stat tracking purposes. Firion's final hit point count, 3,235. Final boss, Emperor Mateus. And my JCC score for this game was a 68.55. Now, I kind of use 100 as the grade of above and below for that score. So what a 68.55 tells me is that in the just under 27 hours I played this game, there wasn't a whole lot of stuff to do. I progressed, built my levels up, made my way through, got the necessary equipment. As I've learned when I played the game, The blood sword is an item that will siphon the life. As you hit, you gain life from what you take from it, but it's not always a guaranteed hit. But when it does hit, it's well worth it. And apparently, second form of Emperor Mateus, the I beat hell, I now rule hell Emperor Mateus, is very susceptible to that weapon. So I exploited that to be able to cheese my way to a victory. Sorry, I did, but hey. So 68.55 is, like I said, this score is not indicative of my rating, but it does say that this game doesn't offer a whole lot of stuff. So my final ratings of the game for now my final score is out of 100. For story, I gave it an 8. Like I said, it does its purpose. It's not the best story, it's not the worst story, but it's good for its time. Gameplay, I gave it a 6. Could have been better. They tried to experiment. It didn't quite hit on all marks. Art design, I also gave it a 6. More or less was the same as Final Fantasy 1 with maybe the entrance of a few cutscenes, small cutscenes. Audio, I gave it a 6.5. The last category is replay value. How likely am I to pick this game up again and play it again? Also, how much extra stuff there would be to do to incentivize anyone to play it post-game? Not much there. I gave it a 5. Out of 100, my final review score of Final Fantasy II is 63. And as comparison, Metacritic has it at 79. 16 points over my review score. As the games will be going along, I'll also be tracking where they rank amongst each other. A few things I can tell you right off the bat. The minus 16 review against Metacritic is probably going to be one of the higher ranking games as far as negatively reviewed against Metacritic. The 68.55, we'll have to track and see how that matches up. The JCC score of 68.55, we'll have to see how that matches up against other games. Final review score of 63, that will probably be seen in the top 10 also as far as lowest games reviewed for this podcast at least. Overall thoughts, Final Fantasy II did have some things going for it. It introduced chocobos to the world. I believe this is the first occurrence of Sid, I believe, in this game. We have our first cutscenes. We have our first real story. As we're going to find in these first few generations of Final Fantasies, the first game is out there. It's out there to do what it can. It's good. The second game, they may take some liberties and try to experiment a little with the formula. But by the third game of that generation, they've hit their stride and they know what they're doing. They're confident that they're getting the most they can out of the system. That's just my personal thoughts. And as we get through these games, I'll share them with you and how they compared against each other and how they rank amongst each other. So next week, no shock, Final Fantasy III. Another game that never got its North American release till much later due to too late in the NES cycle for North Americans. They wanted to move everything to the Super Nintendo system, so we'd have to wait until we get our hands on Final Fantasy III. All right, thanks for taking your time out of your day to listen to me go on and on about video games. I really do appreciate the continued support. Please rate and review this podcast if listening via Apple Podcasts. You can also send me a review via email to taverenpod@gmail.com. TAVERENPOD@gmail.com. I'll get my own, as I mentioned, I'll get my own social footprint for this podcast set up. But until then, you could reach me there. This isn't goodbye. This is until we meet again. I will talk with everyone next week as we ever move forward towards 100. Take care, everyone. Good night. Thank you for listening. Tune in again next week as we will cross another game off of Rob's list as we make our way to the end and enter the JRPG Century Club. Sound and music from this podcast are provided by Eric Matthias. Find all of his great music at soundimage.org.